dreary night of November.
Welcome to Sundays with Frankenstein. When I looked around, I saw and heard of none like me. Was I then a monster, a blot upon the earth, from which all men fled and whom all men disowned? Wandering Spirits, this is episode 8 of Sundays with Frankenstein. We will be covering volume 2, chapters 5 and 6 of the 1818 edition today. I am Edward G. Pettit of the Rosenbach in Philadelphia. Thanks for coming. Joining me today, I hope, are the Ghoul guides, Mary Going and Dr. Lauren Nixon. As you can see, they're not on yet. I have a feeling I should have told them that we turned our clocks forward. And I don't know if they have done that yet in England. I know they do a daylight savings time. I thought we had talked about this a few weeks ago, that it was the same weekend, so all our times would be fine, that kind of thing. But perhaps not. I just sent them an email. Hopefully they will show up, and we can have them on as well. I do know that Anastasia is in the audience. Anastasia, would you like to hop on and co-host until they arrive, or stay here when they do arrive? Let me know in the Q&A if you can do that, and I will enable you as a co-host. I will start your video. I just give her a second. She's going to make herself a little more presentable, and then we will do that. Anastasia, you just give me the high sign when in the Q&A, and then I will enable your video. So thanks for filling in, and hopefully Mary Lauren will make it at some point. And happy Pi Day, everyone. Today, 3/14, it's Pi Day. I know they're making pies downstairs. Maybe I'll get some pie during the show. We will see. I want to remind everybody who's watching live on Zoom in the chat, if you would remember to set your chat to panelists and attendees so everyone can see your chat. And let me tell you a little bit about what I'm drinking today, because that's, something I like to do on the show, as we all know. And today I have a cocktail called Ruins of Empires. And we'll get to why we've named the cocktail that a little later. It includes this chicory root infused vodka from Art in the Age. Very delicious. It's cardamom, simple syrup, and some muddled orange and a little bitters. I actually used blood orange for my when I muddled an orange in it, which I like a lot. And it's an excellent drink. I really like this chicory root flavor. And thanks to Brianna, our chat Igor today, who's putting the recipe in the chat. We'll also post it with the video on our website, and you can see it there if you're just watching this show on video. And thanks to Tamworth Distilling and Art in the Age for coming up with this very yummy concoction. You can buy a kit with all these ingredients at Art in the Age in Philadelphia. And if you haven't already seen, when you go to their page to buy this chicory root vodka, on that page, you can buy it, of course. And they also have this little box here that you can donate to the Rosenbach, which would be very nice. $1, $3, $5. Other is always a good button to pick. And you can donate to the Rosenbach as well. And I thank Art in the Age for supporting the Rosenbach. But I'm not just drinking here today or hosting a solo show for the time being. I'm also talking about Frankenstein, and that's what I do here every week, is dissect, anatomize, dismember, and bring back to life this book by Mary Shelley, chapter by chapter, page by page, word by word, as we create our very own conversational annotation of the entire novel. And in doing this, we at the Rosenbach ask you to support us, which you can do by donation at that Art in the Age site, or you can go and on our site and donate. Or if you're not already a member, please join. The basic membership level at the Rosenbach is called the Mary Shelley level. I'll have a little bit more to say about that at the mid-break. And we will, and I will get started. And then hopefully Anastasia can join me in just a moment. Let me know when you're ready to join. And she is good. And I will bring Anastasia on board. Let me find your name here and more, and promote to panelists. Anastasia, what a treat. Oh, you're muted.
Oh, okay, there we go. Can you hear me all right?
Well, I can hear you just fine. What a treat.
Great.
Thanks for filling in. I have a feeling at the 3 o'clock mark, well, the 1 hour into the show, I have a feeling that Lauren and Mary are gonna come in, that our clocks aren't synced anymore. So
yeah, I was doing some reading before bed last night, and I look at my phone to check the time, and it's suddenly, much later than it should have been. It's like, I haven't been reading for this long. And then I remember, oh, well, this is why it's almost 4 a.m. So caught me unawares too.
Yeah, well, everybody, because we live in such a digital world and with our phones and everything, at least most of the devices we have, the clocks go forward automatically. I have an alarm clock in my bed that does not. So, but it didn't matter. I mean, I kind of knew anyway. So we're at least saved that. It used to be much harder in the old world when you had to change every single clock and watch that you had.
Well, there was this
one. Maybe you don't even remember that, do you? You're young enough. You're like, what do you mean all the clocks didn't go forward?
I do remember that. I am in fact one of those people who can still read an analog clock if I have to, but my own watch is digital. So there's this one time I was studying in Paris, and my phone, my computer, my watch, they all switched automatically. I didn't know daylight savings time had happened for like a week, and then somebody told me.
Well, let's I guess we could just get going with these chapters. And how have you been since last week?
Not bad. I'm kind of in a hell of deadlines, but I think that's just academia. It's just one of those really busy times, and also the end of the quarter. We're on the quarter system, so just lots of emailing, lots of grading, lots of sending applications in for various conferences and summer projects and things. But yeah.
All righty. Well, let's get going then and talk about this. I mean, you've at least read, because you like to do that anyway and keep up with this, or
oh no, Ed, I totally don't read the book. Kind of wing it for the weeks I'm on.
Well, I mean, I had prepared notes anyway, and you're brilliant enough that I'm sure we could just get some off the cuff remarks from you about this chapter. Last week, the creature began to tell his story, and we finished with him so very hopeful. What was he, like happy earth as the spring was coming. And he was so looking forward to becoming a member of the DeLacy family. And so chapter 5 opens up with him now hastening. I now hasten to the more moving part of my story. I shall relate events that impressed me with feelings which, from what I had been, have made me what I am. That's a fascinating, way to form it too, especially with the feelings which have made me what I am. That whole idea of sensibility, right? That we had talked about.
Yeah, well, and also it's interesting because, the more moving parts of my story, like the 2 chapters we already read, they broke my heart. They broke everyone's heart. My mother, after watching last week's show, she was like, I was literally about to ready to cry over the creature. we're already plenty moved, but I think he has this.
Well, there's more to cry, like.
Well, yeah, but I mean, Safie's story and what happens to the DeLacy's, that's very moving. And I think the perspective he's coming at it from is they're in some way more human than me. Their emotions are in some way more moving, more relatable, especially to somebody like Frankenstein. I think the creature senses that Frankenstein is more likely to be moved by the DeLacy's story because they're, actual human beings than by any aspect of the creature's suffering. I think he catches on to that, and that's what he's alluding to in this moment.
It's also he's aware that he's telling a story, and he's aware that, in a sense, that he's shaping the story, and it makes us more aware that this is his point of view of the story, that this is the way he tells it, and what has happened to him has shaped how the story goes itself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
And then we will get, and right away we get, I mean, what before it's the spring again, another reminder. What before was desert and gloomy should now bloom with the most beautiful flowers and verdure. My senses were gratified and refreshed. I mean, he's a romantic poet in the making here, just out there, getting his inspiration from the natural world.
Excuse me.
And then
absolutely, yeah.
And then it's, oh, go ahead.
Well, I was just saying it's an interesting contrast because, here he's just talking about beauty and his senses being gratified. But at the end of the previous chapter, when he had been talking about beauty and my spirits were elevated. So it's interesting to me because those are two different categories. The end of the last chapter seems to me the category of the sublime, being elevated, being awed by the majesty of nature. And then here it's more, it's beautiful, but it's not that, awe-inspiring and fear-inspiring in the same way. So it seems to me that, not only is he appreciating nature, but he's able to experience these two kind of different categories of sublimity and then of beauty, which Kant would have written about, around this time, not when Mary Shelley was writing, but more when the book was set. And Kant very much delineated the sublime and then the beautiful and then the good as like distinct categories that human judgment can access.
Yeah. And for me, I very much read those romantic poets, Wordsworth, going out there and finding those simple joys and deep resonance in very simple things out in nature. Keats is like this too, a lot. Percy Shelley tends to be more the grandiose. It's the big scenes that really seem to thrill him. But it's also another reminder too that the creature is unlike Victor. Victor goes out and can't get the solace or the joy that he wants from nature, but the creature can.
Yeah, well, and I mean, I have a very interesting, I guess you could call it, theory about that. And I think since we have maybe a little time, it's fascinating to me that Victor doesn't seem to have access to this experience of the sublime, because again, the sublime is this really interesting category, which it's not the beautiful, it's the majestic, the awe-inspiring. It's something that's so much grander than yourself as a human being that it inspires awe and also a little bit of fear. But it's not the kind of fear, if you're watching a horror movie and there's like a jump scare, it's not that kind of, visceral fear reaction. It's more of this intellectual fear as you understand your own kind of insignificance in relation to the grandeur of creation. And then, that means you also understand yourself as kind of a creature within creation. And that's such a contrast to Victor, who in the first few chapters wanted to, quote, follow nature to her hiding places, who wanted to dig up bodies and give them life. And it seems to me that his inability to kind of experience the sublime, to have access to the sublime, to the sense of how much greater creation is than him, is tied to his desire to kind of grasp nature, to again follow her to her hiding places, to just kind of be master of it rather than another creature, as opposed to the creature who understands himself as a creature. He understands himself as a creation rather than someone who is attempting to in some way master nature through unhallowed arts or anything else, even though, unlike Victor, he can just climb the mountain, and so the mountain cannot frighten him the way it frightens Victor, and yet nonetheless he seems able to experience the sublime when he looks at it.
Mm-hmm. Oh, good.
Lauren is here.
Lauren is joining us.
Hello.
Hey, Lauren.
Hi.
Hi.
Was it a time issue that we have changed our clocks here?
Yeah.
Man, I should have reminded you. I mean, I was just emailing yesterday and I didn't think to say that. I'm so sorry. Anastasia's in the audience, so she jumped on.
Hi, Anastasia.
So,
Hi.
Mary is on her way.
I'm sorry to have to rush you guys today.
That's okay. You know what? I got ready early and I was like, great, I'll make sure I'm all sorted, like got plenty of time before 7, got everything set up. And then fortunately someone messaged me on Facebook. So
oh, did they?
okay. Yes, thank you very much to George for sounding the alarm.
All righty. So thanks, George.
Here.
So you have your fans were like clamoring for you guys. So.
Well, I'm really excited to be on with Lauren.
And you and Anastasia, feel free to stay for the whole day or a whole afternoon. I don't know how busy your schedule is or whatever, but if you just want to stick around for the whole time, we'll have the 4 of us. That'll be great. That'll be wonderful.
I mean, I might stay just until the kind of half break.
That's fine.
But I'll stay for now. And
it's like my regular life. It's like me and a whole house full of women. So like it'll be that. And I'm
the Rousseauian ideal of education.
It is my ideal. So and I don't put my women in the place that Rousseau likes to. Let's just say that right off the bat. So.
Well, I know you have 5 daughters, so the analogy that comes to mind for me is Mr. Bennet from Pride and Prejudice, who has 5 daughters.
And here's Mary.
Hello.
Hi, Mary.
Hi. Oh my gosh. I was so sorry that. I just didn't even
should
think
have
about,
thought it's entirely my mistake. I should have reminded you guys because I thought we had talked not long ago, and that I thought you guys were on the same like daylight savings schedule.
I thought that we were, and I feel like last year when we were doing, I don't know, was it the other daylight savings? I feel like we've had this conversation before, and it actually timed up.
We're always, I think, like a week behind, and normally I know this because like I follow like a lot of American politics, and like I'm always like really aware of like what times the shows are on, but it just didn't click this week. I don't know.
So there we go. That's fine. Anastasia jumped on too. Anastasia, she'll be on with us for an hour talking about this. Well,
I'm really interested in why we change clocks at kind of different times, because a lot of what I study is time in the 19th century and like the standardization of time and the adoption of Greenwich Mean Time.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm curious as to how we got from that point to we're going to switch our clocks in different weeks for no reason whatsoever. Yeah.
I wonder if it's something to do with like crop types or harvests. Like
I don't know.
Or if it's just something really arbitrary, like the difference between a Z and an S. Like, is it something that we've just adopted? Or is there an actual reason for it?
Well, it's clearly something that doesn't need to be done anymore.
Yes.
But it's remained in place. And there's those odd places. I don't know if you have this in Britain. There's a couple places in America that won't do it. Like, I don't know if it's a city or a township or kind of thing that they don't do it. And so
enforced on all of us.
So they're like an hour off, like for half of every year from everyone else. So
that's fascinating.
But thanks for coming back. And I just want to remind everybody that there is a new episode from the Ghoul Guides up on YouTube. You have a new Kiss, Marry, Kill, which I watched yesterday, and it was a lot of fun. And Mary Shelley's in that too.
Yep.
So she's one of
she's one of
is it Badass Women of Horror? Was that the whole theme, I think?
Yeah, so it was a video that I had planned for Women in Horror Month, which was February. It's quite a new thing, so a lot of people aren't really aware of it. But I just thought, like let's just do Kiss, Marry, Kill, but with, different kinds of women in Gothic and horror. So yeah, the first section was Gothic authors, including Mary Shelley. And then the second section was Badass Women in Horror. And then the final section was kind of, the monstrous feminine, which does also feature the bride of Frankenstein. just a little fun thing, not completely not serious. Just want to throw that out there.
Oh, well done. A lot of fun. No, it's a lot of fun. And it's the way to, it's the way to talk about things that can really lead people to learn more when you're doing it in such a fun way, because you wind up talking about how these things operate and how they work and the meaning of them and why certain things appeal to you. So yeah, no, have fun. So.
I have to say the funniest one to film for me, and I don't know, maybe Lauren, you're the same, is the monstrous feminine one. I think that section is the funniest, and also just in thinking about what makes women monstrous and why are they scary and why are they terrifying. And I guess we can get into that a bit today, looking at the kind of the doubling with a creature and safety. But yeah, that idea of why are these female ghosts, female monsters, or the Bride of Frankenstein, what makes these monsters monstrous?
Yeah, we finished filming that section, and as we finished it, I said to Mary, good luck. Like, you're gonna have
your exact words were, good luck editing that.
Yeah, you guys edit. I don't edit. I'm just going live, so I'm just talking. Mistakes and all are in the show. I had a question for you guys from Bruce. I actually hit it on Facebook, and he was just wondering how you came up with the Ghoul Guide's name.
Oh, okay. So originally, as most of you know, if you watched Sundays with Dracula, Mary and I come originally from a postgrad collective, so research students at the University of Sheffield, called Sheffield Gothic. And up until I finished my PhD, Mary and I co-organised together, and she's currently passing the torch over to some new students. But we'd started a YouTube channel for Sheffield Gothic, and we were coming up with ideas, and Ghoul Guide was the name of a show idea that now is basically what we call Ghoul School. And when we then started talking about, going out on our own, we'd enjoyed doing a couple of videos for the Sheffield Gothic YouTube. We were really enjoying, we just started Sundays, and we said, like, what should we call ourselves? I was never a girl guide, but joined the older, it's called Rangers over here, which is the like 15 plus set where you're allowed to go camping on your own. So you basically join because it means you're allowed to go away for a weekend on your own as a teenager and like fire to things. So I'd been a guide leader. Mary hated, I think you had one really bad experience at Brownies or something, didn't you?
I have a personal reason that is irrational and private as to why I personally don't like the Girl Guides. But also just separate to that, I also had a bad experience in the Brownies, which are like the younger one. So I was just like, I don't mind. I quite like Ghoul Guides, but I just don't want it to be associated with the guides for my own completely irrational reasons.
So it was kind of like,
so that's why in all of our promotional material, we when we did that photo shoot, I was like, let's just go for the detective noir look.
Is it Girl Scouts are called Girl Guides?
Girl Guides over here,
Oh,
so
see,
Girl
I didn't
Scouts
know
are called
that.
Girl Guides.
So
it was kind of a little bit of a joke about, like, it was a pun on Girl Guides, partially because Mary like dislikes them so much, so it was kind of like an anti thing, but also just because we thought we really liked the name that we'd like originally given to this show. We thought it was fun, and it just seemed like a really good way to explain what we were doing, because we were trying to think of something to make it clear that it was like fun but educational and spooky and also kind of stupid and a bit silly sometimes. So we wanted to try and find like that happy medium, and like affectionately, like Mary and the rest of our friends, pet name for me is Goblin. So things like Goblin and Ghoul, we always call each other anyway. So it just
it just personal info out here today.
Yeah, it just kind of like it grew out of like a really dumb private joke between us that Mary and I do this a lot. We start something as a private joke and we say we're never actually going to call it this. Like the pet name for a project or like the name in progress will be something really silly. And then by the time we actually get to the point of launching the project or rolling it out, we can't bear to call it anything different. And we end up running with the name or the tagline. For example, when we did a conference and it ended up being Fast and the Furious themed, because we just take the joke too far. So that was also what happened with Ghoul Guides. It was a joke that went too far. Now it's our brand.
If it was America, you'd have to be the Ghoul Scouts. So
yeah,
and that's the idea that, you know, we should know the Americans watching this. And I just before we get to the chapter, I just wanted to let you guys know too that, especially Mary, my wife and kids have begun watching Supernatural. The youngest, Sophie and Lulu, the teenagers.
Oh goodness!
They're watching They started episode 1, and even they're like 15 seats. Like I don't like. Who knows if they'll get through it all? But they're watching it. So.
It's a lot. It's a lot, and what a wild ride they have in store for them. I will say, and I think there is pretty much a consensus on this, that the best seasons are 1 to 5. So if you just kind of wanted to watch like seasons 1 to 5 and then be like, okay, cool, like this is a nice like 5-season arc, feel like I've got all of that stuff, then that's a good place to stop. I also personally quite like seasons 9 and 10.
Well, they're watching,
seasons 1 to 5 if you want a shorter.
Yeah, I mean, you know, seasons 1 to 5 was what it was originally intended to be, and then they did 10 more seasons. So now, you know,
why not?
Is as old as teenagers, which is scary to think about. And the old seasons are so like dark and kind of brown and gray and nostalgic, you know, Midwestern like American Gothic, and then it gets like bright and saturated, and they have Wi-Fi now. It's really exciting to watch that transition.
That's interesting. Yeah, the development of technology over 15 seasons is, I'm sure, obvious. So phone technology itself changed so much. So
and in like episode 2, they actually go to the library and they're like pulling out old newspapers to the physical copies, and you know, I think in retrospect you're sitting there like, these have all been digitized by now, probably.
Yeah.
All righty. Well, let's move to Frankenstein. And we're in chapter 5, and we just started. We only just started it, talking about it, Mary and Lauren. And we actually had a question that I forgot to answer last week. From just as we're going to get into them all, Felix and Agatha and Safie arrives and all. Adam had a question last week that I never got to about names in this, and the way Mary Shelley names everyone. And we've touched on in the past Victor, and that was also Percy's, you know, a nickname when he was young, and he published some poems under the name of Victor as well. But the Adam writes, he says, I'm not sure if it's really fruitful to try to read too much into her naming conventions. Victor and Felix seem to be named ironically. Victor is not victorious. Felix is not happy. He is unlucky.
Victor wants to be kind of the victor of nature, but you know, there's some issues with that.
Well, he also says Agatha and Safie seem to be non-ironic, good and pure, respectively. And Sophie and Safie are kind of connected as well, which I think she's aiming at. But he also says, I was remembering how Dracula had not many but a handful of. Oh no, that was a whole different question. That was about the kind of light moments, and how in Frankenstein there's not a joke in sight in Frankenstein, that this is relentlessly serious, this novel. And I was trying to combine these two questions into one but maybe they don't combine. But anything on, and perhaps this is a question, this is more of a scholarly question, about naming conventions in early novels and how they are supposed to convey meaning to people. And which I think happened much more in the past than does now.
Shelley does do this. You get it in Perkin Warbeck. I think I mentioned this before. The female lead in Valperga is called Euthanasia. So, you know, sweet death or beautiful death, depending on how you translate it. And you have characters in Gothic novels name things like Mon Mia, There's lots of kind of either French or Latin names that are chosen very specifically to convey meaning. And often you also get surnames that mean certain things, or you get surnames that are connected to certain things. So in Romance of the Forest, the family who finds the heroine Adeline are called the Lamottes.
And Radcliffe novel, Romance of the Forest.
Yeah, and Lamotte was actually a person who had fled from Paris after having been involved in scandal. So naming conventions are usually very specific. Servants are often named like very obvious things. But yeah, names and things like sibilance is really important. So the way that, you know, villains are usually called harsh kind of consonant sounds. So Manfred, you know, Montoni, like they're usually very soft, whereas heroines are Amelia, Emily, Adeline, Mon Ami, Euthanasia, like they're usually these very pleasing sounds. And the important thing to remember is most texts right up really until probably the 1850s would be read aloud. So you're getting, and that's why you have so many commas. If you've ever wondered why there's so many commas in 18th century fiction, it's because you're reading them aloud. So in Gothic fiction, it's like she looked to the door and then sigh. Like the reason you have so many commas is it's almost like stage direction. You're trying to force the reader to build that suspense to their family listening by the fireside. So
that the reader could just kind of do the William Shatner pronunciation.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, exactly. It's like you actually get, if you try and read a Gothic novel, you get breathless. Like it's actually, if you try and read them aloud, it's actually really difficult because you can't breathe by the time you get to the end of the sentence. So you are about to swoon like the heroine because you haven't breathed for about 7 sentence clauses, and you get these massive long sentences.
So Ed, how about we do a Gothic reading group at the Rosenbach, and then by the end we're all just kind of, you know, and we need our brandy.
To do like at Vegas and pump oxygen into the room.
Smelling salts or brandy, you know.
Yes, yeah.
Okay, for resuscitation.
I'll bring the brandy, definitely.
Yeah.
I'm sorry to whoever I made spit out their wine. Somebody said not what I said, William Shatner, they spat out their, so I apologize for that.
Yeah, so yeah, it is naming conventions in terms of meaning are really important, but naming conventions in terms of sound is really important. So like Agatha is quite a traditional Gothic name. You have lots of Agathas, lots of Agneses. It has heavy Christian, particularly Catholic connotations.
Lamb, you know, yeah.
Yeah, and then with Safi or Safi, depending on how you want to pronounce it, you've got that kind of, I don't know what you would say, Mary, but it is, I would call it orientalizing of a name. So she, you know, because she's supposed to be a Christian born to a Christian Arab mother slave. So you've got that kind of like orientalization of where it's still permissible, but it is also a foreign other. So you're very much thinking about sound. You're thinking about the way that a name feels and the way that it's almost, sometimes say to students, it's the way a name tastes. When you say a name, you know, even if you haven't got synesthesia, you know, it feels a certain way, it sounds a certain way. So, you know, Victor is in that it's almost in that convention of and I think I kind of said this before, he's more like a Gothic villain than he is a Gothic hero. Even his naming conventions, you know, heroes are called Valancourt and Theodore and like Vivaldi. Like, I mean, yeah, one of Radcliffe's heroes is called Vivaldi, which literally translates to, you know, lively, sprightly, like, and he is this very energetic, enthusiastic, almost too much young man. And then you have Victor Frankenstein, like you've got that kind of sounding.
We also get the irony hits right here in this chapter, especially. It's at the beginning. The creature says, I observed the countenance of Felix was melancholy beyond expression. And the fact that Felix, meaning fortunate, lucky, was melancholy beyond expression, it kind of drives that home if you're aware of and far more readers in the past would have been aware of the Latinate roots of these words, and that Felix meant fortunate or lucky.
The majority, and that is definitely, I know we always say this, but the majority of readers would be aware of like these names and be aware of these things, because even like the most basic of education, you would, I mean, if you've read Northanger Abbey, Austen makes a joke about it at the beginning where she can quote certain lines from Richardson and certain lines from Johnson, because that's what you give in an education. So usually most people's basic education had a little bit of Latin in it, and you know, you'd read Paradise Lost, you'd read X, Y, and Z. So most readers would kind of have that working knowledge of these naming conventions, and yeah, Shelley definitely does engage with it quite a lot.
And I wonder if sort of there's a change once you get from romantic literature to kind of realist fiction towards the end of the century. Romanticism is kind of, you know, early 19th century, and then realist fiction is later in the century. And I think once you get to realist fiction, there's less of that obsession with names being like symbolic in that way and having all those connotations. And I think that's part of what makes Dracula kind of this weird generic thing where it's more like a romance than a realist novel, because of course all the names have these meanings. Lucy means light, and all of these things.
Yeah.
Good. Let's get to the chapter. Well, because I want to get to I got to get to Safie, because Safie arrives, and obviously everybody is, you know, beyond, you know, happy. Well, it starts with Felix, and the way Safie's described when she comes in here. She's a lady on horseback, dark suit, and covered with a thick black veil. I like her almost goth entrance into this novel. But her voice was musical, and the creature notices that it's unlike that of either of my friends. And I love that he's referring to them as my friends there. I beheld a countenance of angelic beauty and expression, her hair of a shining raven black and curiously braided. Her eyes were dark but gentle, which is an important thing for the creature. What do we make of her description and how it's, well, I won't even load that question. What do you guys make of her description in this, and how the creature sees her? Or do you want me to load it?
I mean, I think Lauren is correct in saying that Safie is orientalized, and she's orientalized in a safe way, in a Christian way. You know, her complexion is wondrously fair, which means white, but she's also othered. So in the Gothic, you have the trope of women singing, and the voice kind of symbolizing your inner morality or inner kind of goodliness. So immediately the creature knows this is a good person, this is a nice person, but her voice is different. She's immediately othered by her voice.
Yeah.
And then you have the veil, which again, it's another kind of Gothic trope, but it's also an Oriental trope, or the way that, you know, the construct of the Oriental woman is created with that kind of full length black veil, and the fact that she has dark hair and dark eyes. Again, she's white, but she's still other, and you get this throughout the kind of the text, where she is where she identified as the Arabian, continually.
The sweet Arabian, yeah, she's the sweet
Arabian, yeah. And it's a way, you know, even though she is a Christian Arab, as we learn later, that kind of foreignness, that Arabian, that kind of that religious, ethnic kind of other, that's foregrounded in a kind of similar way that for the creature, you know, we have all of these other epithets that are given to him, you know, monster, wretch, all of these kinds of things, other than his name. And obviously the creature doesn't have a name, but Safie does. So it is odd, and I think we're meant to pick up on that, that she's a safe other, a Christian other, but she's still an other. And also that kind of the way that she is physically constructed, but also named in the text, I think is really important.
Sweet
Yeah.
Arabian was the runner-up name for my drink today, but I thought it was too patronizing. So I was like, yeah, I can't call it Sweet Arabian. So it's Ruins of Empires. You guys missed that. That's what my
I
drink.
like that.
Ruins.
What's
of
I think,
Empires.
yeah, and I think, you know, I mean, Edward Said's work is obviously like really fundamental to kind of post-colonial work, but I think that it's still really important. And what he kind of discusses, especially in his kind of seminal work, Orientalist, I think that's what it's called, is the idea that specifically Orientalism, that's the one. But there's the idea that, especially in, you know, the European Christian West, in the literary imagination, authors basically construct a fictional stage, and they populate it with these characters that aren't real. They're complete constructs and fictions, and artificial kind of creations that really only symbolize, they're not actually talking about the Oriental woman. And especially I think what Safi is doing is she's really used as a kind of sign or a signifier of women, which I think is problematic. And obviously that's what Said says in his work. But yeah, I think that's also really important to kind of bear in mind with the depiction of Safi, that she is a kind of a Western European Christian construct of what a kind of Oriental other could be.
Yeah,
I was
and
quite
it's
happy.
interesting because
Go ahead.
she's exoticized. You know, she's very you know, when we say Oriental and Orientalism, we are specifically talking kind of Turkey onwards. So it is, you know, pretty much the whole of, you know, the great Asian continent, like
the Ottoman Empire. So
yeah, like
here,
but interestingly, also Spain and Portugal get included in this as well, because you have the kind of overhang of the Moorish Empire. So things like the long black veil kind of calls to a Spanish perhaps presentation. So you have this other type of Christianity, and you have like the intermingling of Greece and Turkey and Orthodoxism and things like that. So usually what happens when we get presented with an Oriental other and it's a woman is it's heavily exoticized and it's heavily sexualized. And it's usually kind of contrasted with a very Anglo-Saxon, because there's no such thing as Anglo-Saxon, but you know, in the myth making, an Anglo-Saxon woman, like in Ivanhoe, which Mary has done really great work on.
There we get Rebecca and
and Marina, but yeah, the kind of interesting thing here is obviously that Shelley is doing something slightly different, and you could argue that's because this is a woman presenting a woman, but she is still, you know, she's almost white passing. She's allowed that card, and it's almost like transferring the we call it honorary Protestant. So when a Catholic character in a Gothic novel, so if it's set in 15th century France, obviously they're a Catholic, but they're allowed to be what we call an honorary Protestant because they have the right type of morals and the right type of, you know, whatever it might be. So it's almost like a new iteration of that kind of honorary Protestant that you get here, which is problematic in its own way, because
it's also kind of connected, it's also racialized through Safi, through blood, and the way that you do get these constructs of kind of ethnic religions. So you know, her father is Muslim, he's a Muslim Arab, and he's from Turkey, but her mother is Christian, which means that part of her bloodline is, you know, good, if you're using that kind of I mean, it's wrong and it's problematic, but if you're using that dichotomy, her bloodline is also you know, Christianized in that way.
We'll definitely get to her mother later, because I think that's a key part of this. But just briefly to say that her mother's Christian Arab, and her father is not only Turkish, but he's called the Turk. So Safi is the sweet Arabian, and the father is the Turk. And so Shelley even presents this kind of you know, dichotomy, this comparison within their own family, that, you know, that Safi gets to be the appealing, beautiful one, and the father is this tyrannical Turk. So let's jump back in. Everybody loves her, and Felix automatically feels better. I love the line too that, at that moment, the creature says, at that moment, I thought him, Felix, I thought him as beautiful as the stranger. Like, as soon as Felix sees her, Felix himself becomes beautiful just as she is. And then we get right into more connections with the creature, because she did not appear to understand him, Felix, but smiled. She, a little further on, she uttered articulate sounds, but appeared to have a language of her own. So she, just like the creature, can't communicate with these people yet, and then we'll learn, just as and along with the creature, how to do that. But there's that little line at the end of the one paragraph: the young stranger knelt at the old man's feet, the father de Lacy, and would have kissed his hand, and he raised her and embraced her affectionately. And that, which becomes a tragic image for the creature, this father, figure, and this, young woman embracing, like he's accepted her into the family. Not only is that what he wants from the de Lacys, the creature himself, but this is clearly what did not happen with him, with Victor. And he's already accused Victor of this. So but right in the language, she was endeavoring to learn their language, and the idea instantly occurred to me that I should make use of the same instructions to the same end. I ardently desired to understand them, and bent every faculty towards that purpose, and found it utterly impossible. That the creature is going to learn language, or at least the language that they speak, which is French. We should let everybody know that this is all in French, because the de Lacys are from France, and that's the language Safi has to learn. But Victor's family almost certainly speaks French too. They could speak German, but it seems like their first language is French, being from Switzerland, the way this novel is put together. Safi plays the guitar and sings so entrancingly beautiful that they at once drew tears of sorrow and delight from my eyes. She sings like a nightingale of the woods. That he really empowers her. As we remember in a couple chapters ago, the creature tries to sound like the birds and can't, and comments on how he can't sound like nature. But here, Safi can do that. And it's a little Beauty and the Beast-ish kind of thing going on here too, isn't there?
Yeah, this section in particular, the creature kind of finding the de Lacys in this countryside setting, takes it into that kind of liminal Gothic space of the rural idyll. And I think this is one of those moments that often we talk about as romantic, and it is romantic big R. It is a romantic scene, and it is leaning into what becomes a really defining facet of romanticism. But this is actually a really carefully constructed Gothic moment, and it adds into that foreshadowing, because the reader of the Gothic knows that the country idyll that you are introduced to at the beginning of a novel, particularly a novel like Claremont by Regina Moray Roche, is unsustainable. The heroine is never able to stay in the country idyll, and the kind of peace and the sweetness is always disrupted. So this kind of scene, the creature doesn't know it, but the reader would definitely be familiar with what Shelley is constructing here. And I think it's one of those moments that makes this a Gothic novel, that we perhaps don't pick up on as much. But this whole kind of, when they're singing together, and the communication between people who cannot speak to one another but can sing, that's a really important Gothic trope. So this is it's halfway through the novel, but for the creature, this is the introduction to his Gothic novel. So it's kind of playing with that metatextual element again, that this is what we would expect from the first 2 to 4 chapters of a Gothic novel. and we're getting it partway through, but it's very much at the beginning of the creature's narrative. So it's a really interesting construct from that respect.
And what really interests me is kind of, you were getting a little bit at the way that the creature and Safi are almost opposites of each other, that, they're both othered when you were talking about Orientalism and the way that, that others Safi, but at the same time, that she is othered, and yet in some ways she's not. She's still beautiful. She's still accepted by the de Lacy. She still sings like a nightingale, and beauty is so often a signifier of goodness, especially like the Gothic novel, early romantic fiction. And then you have kind of the creature who is also othered, but he can't talk, he can't sing like a nightingale, he is not beautiful. I'm very fascinated by the way that juxtaposition functions in these two chapters.
Yeah. And we'll certainly have more of it as we go forward. The creature, I love this, how he's learning language and even says, I may boast that I improved more rapidly than the Arabian, who understood very little and conversed in broken accents, whilst I comprehended and could imitate almost every word that was spoken. And normally it's like, he's almost mansplaining, like, I can, learn that. But for the creature, I just feel like, wow, is that the only time in this novel that he's literally proud of something he can do? And I think it actually is. And it also highlights how his mastery of language is so quick that he's not only superhuman in strength and agility that Victor has already witnessed when he first met him, but he's also brilliant beyond any human capacity. That way he's able to learn language so quickly. I mean, and his first books are like Paradise Lost, he doesn't need See Spot Run, he just comes right to Milton for the books that he can read. And that creates him. He is he is superhuman in that. I mean, he's far more like, a mutant in the Marvel, universe with these like special, powers that he has than he is a monster. Like if you pull him into our age, he's more of a superhero than a monster.
Well, maybe the brain he inherited new language and is just, triggering those pathways, which it's maybe that's more likely than him just learning language by listening in that way. But
yeah, maybe it's more like an iZombie situation, like he's like inheriting the brain.
One of the I was thinking Dracula and Mark Gatiss's Dracula, that when Dracula bites people, he automatically knows everything they can know. So when he's having trouble with his German, he feeds on this German guy on the Demeter, and then he can converse in German to the woman that he's having dinner with. So,
and that's also like in A Discovery of Witches, which I know Mary mentioned before. It's like that thing where if a vampire drinks somebody's blood and then they have their knowledge, they have their memories. Maybe it's that kind of thing.
Well, Mary doesn't explain that in the book. She doesn't, Mary Shelley doesn't give us this reason, but it seems to be something that everybody seems to infer, right away about the creature and how he learns language, that he must have these things from whoever he was created from. And especially as neuroscience develops in the 19th century, that tends to be the answer, that, it's the brain that he was given must be great. But regardless of how it happens, certainly the point being made is that he is super intelligent, just as he is super strong. And he talks about how I learned the science of letters, which I like how that's phrased. And it opened before me a wide field for wonder and delight. And he doesn't read the book, but the first book that he does hear, because Felix is reading it aloud to Safi, because somehow he has picked out this book as being a book that, is the declamatory style was framed in imitation of the Eastern authors. But he's reading Volney's Ruins of Empires, as I'll take a drink from my Ruins of Empires there. And Volney, the Comte de Volney, the Constantine Francois de Chasseboeuf Comte de Volney, had written this Ruins of Empires right kind of before, during the French Revolution. He was actually kind of part of that in a way.
Yeah, it's contemporary too.
Yeah. It's published in 1792. Well, 1791, and then there's an English translation in 1792. And actually that first English translation is by a close friend of William Godwin. James Marshall is the one that translates it. So clearly, not only does Mary Shelley know this book, of Percy actually loved Volney as well and had been reading it shortly before, she was writing Frankenstein. So, but she probably knew this book from even childhood. The book itself it's kind of a critique of all the ideologies of the world. It's very much a radical work of free thinking. Of course, Percy loved it and Godwin loved it. The British Library gives this great little description of it that I'll just read from the British Library site. And it was a major source of inspiration for free thinkers in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. The work describes the world's most important religions, condemns the corruption and despotism of the Christian church, discusses wealth, rank, and property, and analyzes the fall of ancient civilizations. Volney proposes that eventually all religions will merge under the consensus of underlying truths. The thrust of societies, as proposed by the genius that converses with Volney, is towards greater sharing of ideas, and the understanding and individual fulfillment can be achieved within the improvement of society. So,
yeah, that sounds. That book sounds like such a product of the French Revolution.
Yeah.
Oh, 100%.
I have my edition has a cover of one of the editions, or the frontispiece from 1792, and it says that the author was a deputy to the National Assembly of 1789. So the way the French Revolution started is the kind of the Estates General was convened because France was having some issues with their national debt and a lot of other problems. So they convened the National Assembly and they sent a bunch of deputies to it, and it seemed, and then it just kind of took off and became I'm greatly simplifying, but it took off and became the French Revolution. And you had like the storming of the Bastille, you have the Terror, which the height of the Terror was 1793, when they executed Louis the XVI. So it's written by somebody who seems to be at the very center of kind of the French Revolution and all of the ideals and thinking that was happening with that. And, we know that Mary Wollstonecraft and Godwin, and thus Mary Shelley, were very much influenced by the ideas and the writing of the French Revolution. Mary Wollstonecraft was writing Vindication of the Rights of Women, while in France you had someone named Olympe de Gouges who wrote basically, after the French Revolution came out with Declaration of the Rights of Man, she came out with Declaration of the Rights of Women, which was the same thing, but it included women, and then they guillotined her. It's very unfortunate, yeah. Which is all to say that kind of all of this thought about, political structures, how to structure human society, equality, all of these questions that the French Revolution was in some way a product of and responding to. That's something Mary Shelley would have been very much engaged with and raised in. And
yeah. And this Ruins of Empires is essentially the battle cry of 1791. So 1791 is the year that the revolutionaries, so the assembly and what becomes the directory, they start to declare war. And the way that it's basically kind of imagined by the revolutionaries is, there will be one religion, one man. We're getting to the point where we're starting to have all of these kind of conversations about what will the religion be, and how will we govern, and essentially the revolutionaries kind of look at the monarchy, particularly, of course, Marie Antoinette's brother, who is, you know, king, god, emperor, slightly down the map in Europe, and invasion by the revolutionaries. So the French revolutionaries start to invade other countries, not for land or power, but almost like a mission, you know, like a missionary statement that, you know, we need to liberate the people.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we need to liberate the people. So 1791 is the year that war breaks out between the revolutionaries and particularly Prussia. 1792, it starts to grow. 1793 is the year that Britain joins the War of the First Coalition. So the Revolutionary Wars start in 1791. 1792, England is like, oh, do we not? 1793, France, that's when it kicks off. So as Anastasia said, that's when the war, that's when the terror starts, and people start getting their heads chopped off, and Edmund Burke gets very upset, and they expel the French diplomat from the British court, and France says, okay, that's it, we're going to war. So this text being, you know, a product of 1791, appearing in Britain in 1792, this is really, you know, fundamental to the revolutionary ideal. And
it comes to America too. And it comes to America. And Volney himself comes to America.
Yeah.
John Adams kicks him out because he thinks he's a spy at one point. But then actually Volney comes back and stays with Jefferson at Monticello while Jefferson is translating Ruins of Empire with Volney, you know, like, and helping him translate it.
And it's really interesting because, you know, we're in 1818. So anyone reading this already knows that the revolution is a dead dream. Like, and you have that kind of bittersweetness here of the creature doesn't know about the revolution. The reader does know about the revolution. They know about Napoleon. They know what happened. So when you get that kind of, you know, the degeneration of the Roman Empire, because we've just gone through this massive period of neoclassicism and the revival of democracy in the Roman Empire, this is this kind of really interesting statement about Victor and the creature's relationship, but also about, you know, the world and the Europe that we are currently living in the course of this novel. So an 1818 reader would be like, let
me put a pin in it for a little bit, and then just I want to remind everybody, if I saw someone had raised their hand, and if you have a question for me or for any of the co-hosts, put it in the Q&A, and then we'll hit your question that way, as if you're watching live on Zoom. And and Anastasia, you wanted to add to that, and then I'm going to take a mid-break.
Yeah, well, I was just going to say really quickly that, you know, especially I think in France, Romanticism is kind of understood as this reaction to the Enlightenment, but also the horrors of the French Revolution, where, you know, the French Revolution, when it was begun, it was understood to be as, you know, this product of the Enlightenment, of this kind of rationality of all of this thought about humans being equal and how to create a more equitable society. And then it ended in, well, firstly, the terror, which, you know, they were executing people for like the slightest suspicions. You know, you had dozens of executions per day, like heads piling up in baskets, and they were being guillotined. There was lots of French kind of horror fiction about this. They executed the monarchs, obviously, Louis the 16th and Marie Antoinette, and then you had Napoleon. So all of these kind of irrational Enlightenment ideals ended in blood and war and terror. And so the Romantic generation, especially in France, was feeling very lost. They were feeling, you know, they were trying to understand their place in society. They were trying to understand, well, you know, how do we build a way of living and existing when all of these Enlightenment ideals failed us? And, you know, Shelley's very much writing around this time. 1816 was, you know, the year after Napoleon was finally defeated in Waterloo and sent off literally to the middle of the Atlantic Ocean because Well, they tried to put him like on an island in the Mediterranean first, but then he escaped and came back to like try to take over again. So they're like, okay, we got to put him in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean so he can't escape. So Shelley's very much writing in the aftermath of this kind of a failure of what was felt, especially in France, as this failure of the Enlightenment, and something that was felt across the continent, of course. I mean, the revolution happened in France, but all of the nations of the continent were kind of like, they're beheading their monarchs. Like, this is bad for our monarchies. We should intervene because like, we know, what if it starts happening here too? We need to cut this off at the pass. So the French Revolution was very much like a continental and even a transatlantic thing in terms of how other nations were reacting to it and how it was influencing their thoughts.
Good. All right. And that too. And I also want to get into the idea of ruins here, ruins of empires and that connection with the Gothic. But I want to take a little mid-break. And before we take a mid-break, I notice Mary's parents are watching. Set your chat to all attendees so everybody can see your comments there. So
hi, Mary's parents.
Yes.
Hello, yeah, they're also probably an hour late because as I didn't realize the time zone.
Wow, they seem to be in the middle here. Yeah, that's fine. Everyone, we bring Sundays with Frankenstein to you for free, as we did Sundays with Dracula last year. So if you'd like to donate to the Rosenbach, you can do so at our website, but you can also become a member. Members of the Rosenbach get free and exclusive access to some programs. Excuse me, I just got a pie delivery, everyone.
I could just see the shadows
here. So
I love that.
A little mini apple pie. Is this what they are? Yeah. They are a little mini apple pie. So
amazing.
No, I could just see the shadow behind you of somebody bringing something, and the cabinet of Dr. Caligari or something. What?
Trying to make a shadow as you're doing that.
Yeah.
Yes, I will spare everybody me eating on the screen with this beard, but I will be definitely enjoying this apple pie soon. But I wanted to ask everybody to become a member. Members of the Rosenbach get free and exclusive access to some Rosenbach programs, plus 10% off any of our reading courses, 50% off of any paid Rosenbach programs. And the basic membership level is called the Mary Shelley level. So what could be more perfect for you Franken readers to join the Rosenbach at the Mary Shelley level and help us bring the books and manuscripts in our collections to life. And I want to give a shout out to some new members, people who just joined the Rosenbach the last week at the Mary Shelley level. And I want to thank Sean from Concord, Massachusetts, and that's Sean, S-H-A-W-N. So if you're watching, thank you. Catherine from Willoughby, Ohio, and Ralph from Philadelphia, and Marta from Philadelphia. Thank you all. If you're watching, thank you for your support. And to everyone who has joined the Rosenbach or given a donation, your support helps me make this show, but also helps the Rosenbach continue to create programs and care for our collections. And so now that you're members, you can get 50% off the upcoming program, which is this Thursday night. And we've already got a bunch of people registered for this. And let me share this program with you right now. This is a talk called Frankenstein, Mary Shelley, Victor Frankenstein, and the Creature in the Contemporary World. It is by David H. Gustin, will be our guest. He is the foundation professor at Arizona State University, where he directs the School for the Future of Innovation in Society within Arizona State University's College of Global Futures. He's also one of the editors of the annotated Frankenstein that is annotated for scientists, engineers, and creators of all kinds. His talk entitled Frankenstein, Mary Shelley, I already said that. It's this Thursday night on the 18th, March 18th. It'll be really exciting, and I can't wait for that to happen. And actually, if you go on our site here, you can go virtual programs. You can also click on virtual courses. And I actually have a course coming up. There's plenty of wonderful courses. A Zora Neale Hurston course that starts this week. And my Read the Blood of Dracula is continuing. and I'm covering Richard Matheson's I Am Legend next Tuesday night, next Monday night. It's March 22nd, whatever day of the week that is. Monday, thank you. Monday, March 22nd, I'm doing Richard Matheson's I Am Legend. You can sign up for individual sessions of Read the Blood of Dracula, and that's why I mention it, and it'll be really enjoyable. And there's an Oscar Wilde course there coming up. I think, Anastasia, you're in that class. So
yeah, I'm very excited for that.
Taught by Margaret Stett, so that'll be really cool. So lots of great things here at the Rosenbach. Thank you all for your support, and there's even more to do. The back to Ruins of Empire. I love that it's called Ruins of Empires, and the connection with the Gothic and ruins and the whole, the architectural pursuit in the 18th century into the 19th, of people actually creating ruins on their properties, at least the upper classes, but that also Mary and Percy, when they first elope in 1814, and they go to Europe, it's just after the war has ended, war with Napoleon has ended. So they're among the first, tourists that get to go back through Europe. And one of the things that they noticed is the destruction that the war has wrought, that Europe itself is in kind of ruin after these, long Napoleonic wars, over a decade of wars in Europe. And this is the novel. Can you guys want to talk a little bit about just that idea of ruins of empires and how that informs what's this, not just the book, but the idea of it?
Yeah. Well, I'm trying to think how not to just talk about war like I always do. This is a really important thing. And this really links to what Anastasia was saying about, the death of the Enlightenment in the post-Napoleonic. War by the Enlightenment is kind of this anomaly. Empire is sustained by war. There can be no empire without war, but we don't want to see war. And this becomes a really kind of strange concern. And you get this a lot in Jane Austen. I haven't published it yet, but I promise I will soon. But those of you that are familiar with Austen, Jane Austen's Persuasion comes out in 1818. It's set in 1815. It's written after Waterloo. It's very, very specifically set in 1815, in that year when Napoleon is on Corsica and the war is meant to be over. And that novel ends with the happy ending. And Wentworth reconcile. They are going to live this beautiful life, and she's going to be a naval officer's wife. Right at the very end of the novel, you have this moment where Austen kind of pulls the rug and is like, yeah, being a naval officer's wife means that sometimes your husband has to go to war. And then the novel ends. And we, the reader, know in the next months after this novel ends, Waterloo is going to happen.
Yeah.
And Captain Wentworth is almost definitely going to be some way involved in Waterloo. And what it really brings up, and the reason why I mention it now, is because this point in time, 1815, is such a stark year because everything's destroyed. And there's this real anxiety about when do we start to recover? And then it happens again. And the thing is that this has always been the case. Europe has been ravaged by war for centuries, and it's supposed to be barbaric. It's supposed to be a thing of the past. So in the Enlightenment itself, war is Gothic because war is barbaric. War does not fit with Enlightenment principles. We do not look at war. We do not see war. We don't think about war. England gets to keep war at a distance because it doesn't have to see it. Its poor people have to deal with it because they have to pay the taxes. There's no grain. Peterloo happens 2 years later. And people have been talking a lot about Peterloo at the moment with the vigil that happened last night. There's this big kind of tragedy, but we try and sweep it under the rug because we don't want to think about the effects of war. Europe doesn't have that that ability because everything is ruined.
Mm-hmm.
The thing is that you get this weird sort of like almost metatext because it's ruin on a ruin. These things that have been ruined by the Napoleonic Wars were built on the ruins of the 7 Years' War, the 100 Years' War, the Crusades. You know, it's ruin on a ruin on a ruin. So this site was once the something of the something of the something. So it's this kind of really strange moment of kind of, well, why did this happen? What did we gain? Did we gain anything? Did we learn anything? Where do we even start? And really the post-Napoleonic mirrors so closely post-World War II. You can see lots of similarities in the fiction that comes afterwards. So this idea of ruins of empires, we're talking in text pre-revolution, not pre-revolution, but kind of pre-Napoleonic at least. This probably Revolutionary Wars, but pre-Napoleonic. But the reader is post.
Mm-hmm.
So you've got this kind of weird, it's almost a palimpsest, like Europe itself at this point. So this mention of, you know, the American hemisphere and how Safie and the creature both weep for the original inhabitants, you know, during the Revolutionary Wars, a lot of the anti-war propaganda was, well, we have a slavery problem. You know, we're abusing people and you're telling us that we have to fight against the revolutionaries because they are rapists and murderers and, you know, they're greedy and they're immoral. Like, where are our morals? So all the way through you have this real tension, and then after it ends, most of Britain gets to glory because they push back invasion, but the rest of Europe and Europe as a whole is kind of like, where now?
Mm-hmm.
So the ruin, you know, war was always Gothic. The ruin was always Gothic for multiple reasons. It's barbaric, it's old. You know, when we go back to and if you're interested in where the word Gothic comes from, Mary and I have a video about it, so check out the Ghoul Guides YouTube channel. But like both those things are Gothic. A ruin is usually the product of war or conflict. You know, in England, a lot of ruins are monasteries. It's not necessarily a war, but it is a war. It's a war of ideals. So it's that kind of, it's Gothic on a multi-layer. So the inclusion of this text kind of is hitting all of these different beats.
And in England, Bob asked this question because I mentioned people creating ruins on their properties. And it just very briefly, I don't want to get too much into it, but that's actually what was going on in 18th century England. And it's like the aesthetically
you build a folly
look of a ruin, and you would literally have things built and they're already ruins. You would just kind of half build it and make it look.
If you've read Northanger Abbey, they go to Sham Castle in Bristol, which was just up the road from where I used to live in Bath. It is a fake front of a castle.
Mm-hmm.
My university, I went to Bath Spa University. There is a ruin of a 13th century castle on that property where I used to have lectures. I used to have my Gothic seminar in a 13th century ruined castle. But there was also a lake. The lake was fake. The walk round the lake was fake. And there was a huge Grecian folly and then a hermitage. So, you know, you would pay someone to live on your property and be a hermit.
I would do that.
Yes.
That's so great. But do you get Wi-Fi as a hermit? Like, is that
I hope so.
I
mean, I think you could probably connect to Edurome from where that was. So I used to go down there quite a lot. I just found it really fascinating. But all of this, like, it's all carefully constructed. You know, like Chatsworth. When you drive up to Chatsworth, they got rid of the original road, rebuilt the road so that when you come around the corner, you see Chatsworth appear kind of from around it. And Beckford, if you're interested in Gothic oddities and you don't know about William Beckford, Beckford's Tower in Bath, it's the same kind of thing. He builds, and it's very much like Strawberry Hill, he builds this insane Gothic tower. And he was so... he was such a kind of like eccentric dude that he's like, I don't want to travel on the road like the rest of the plebs. And he builds his own road from his tower to Bath so that he can just go up and down this road without having to bother, you know, with the rest of the carriages and things like that. So you have this huge, and a lot of the landscapes now in England in particular kind of like around London, Bath and Derbyshire, we have these landscapes that we think of natural landscapes. because they seem to be like lakes and they're overgrown. They're all man-made. They're all constructed. They're all very specifically designed. And yeah, we have fake ruins. England is littered with fake ruins and fake, you know, Rococo Gothic. You have fake 15th century, fake 16th century styles. You have fake ruins. You have fake Greek and Roman, because, you know, we have Roman ruins in England in some places. So let's build fake Roman ruins. So it's this really strange sort of like fallacy. The ruin, you know, the ruin is also kind of a fallacy. So she's really playing with that kind of idea of something kind of falling apart. And she does kind of mention the degeneration of Rome, and that choice of wording there, the degeneration, plays really heavily into that Gothic idea of kind of, it's not a deconstruction, it's not the fall of Rome, it is the degeneration, which is interesting because, you know, the Gothic is both positive and negative in these phrases, where it's like barbaric, but also the other, and we love the other, and, you know, you have it used for good in the creature. But
all right, let me put it into our ruins digression.
Oh man,
I love
that's
digression.
I love talking about
talk about this all day. But it's interesting because Ruins of Empires by Volney is a hopeful, you know, kind of philosophy, that he really believes that that eventually, you know, the improvement, because, you know, because of our, you know, advances in thought and free thinking, that we will eventually all improve and get better. But what the creature is learning from this book is he's kind of learning the history of the world, you know, that he says, was man indeed at once so powerful, so virtuous and magnificent, yet so vicious and base? To be a great and virtuous man appeared the highest honor that can befall a sensitive being. To be base and vicious, as many on record have been, appeared the lowest degradation, a condition more abject than that of the blind mole or the harmless worm. He hears the details of vice and bloodshed, you know, the strange system of human society, the division of property, immense wealth and squalid poverty, rank descent and noble blood. And what it leads him to think of, this whole history of humankind and the conflicts that have come about because of it, is that he says, and what was I? Of my creation and creator, I was absolutely ignorant, but I knew that I possessed no money, no friends, no kind of property. I was, besides, endowed with a figure hideously deformed and loathsome. I was not even of the same nature as men. I was more agile than they and could subsist upon coarser diet. We know he's also smarter. I bore the extremes of heat and cold with less injury to my frame. My stature far exceeded theirs. When I looked around, I saw and heard of none like me. Was I then a monster, a blot upon the earth, from which all men fled and whom all men disowned? This is his reaction to learning the history of humans. It's, you know, and when he applies his own experience to it, he is monstrous, or he's at least trying to understand why he seems monstrous to the rest of people.
Yeah, well, and in that first paragraph you read aloud, Ed, where he, you know, he's trying to understand human nature. I mean, you know, he sounds like an Enlightenment philosopher. You know, is man, you know, good? Is man bad? You know, how is it that man can be, you know, virtuous, but also, you know, terrible and evil and base at the same time? And you know, what is the crux of human nature there? And then, you know, he's trying to kind of place himself, you know, compare himself to other human beings and trying to place himself in relation to that.
He has one more thing towards the end of this chapter here that harkens to a book he will that he has already read when he's telling this story, and this is why I think it comes out here. But he hasn't read this yet in his own, you know, chronology, because he says, of what a strange nature is knowledge. I learned there was but one means to overcome the sensation of pain, and that was death. I was, is this where it is? yeah, the fact that he is he's unhappy because he is learning. Oh, I was just before that, the agony that these reflections inflicted upon me. The sorrow only increased with knowledge. Oh, that I had forever remained in my native wood, nor known nor felt beyond the sensations of hunger, thirst, and heat. I mean, he's effectively saying that like knowledge brings me grief, makes me miserable, just as Adam and Eve eat of the tree of knowledge of good and evil and then are banned from the garden. You know, he's wishing he could go back to his native wood, the creature here, where he, you know, and just as Adam and Eve are cast out from the Garden of Eden. So, hearkening forward to Paradise Lost, which he will read shortly, but obviously the influence on him already that he is.
I think it's a really interesting moment because it really does parallel him specifically with Eve. In that kind of focus on the link between knowledge and the kind of the rejection from paradise, that kind of I was once in Eden and now I'm not, and the introduction of death, which is, you know, and especially in the kind of Miltonic Eve, that's what happens. Eve is linked to the kind of eating of the forbidden fruit, which then leads to this kind of greater knowledge, but this forbidden knowledge, and then death enters the world. And you have this other moment, you know, earlier you have the kind of the reflection scene, which is one of my favorite scenes in this book, where, you know, the creature looks at himself and thinks he's monstrous. And obviously in Milton's Paradise Lost, Eve looks at herself and she thinks she's beautiful, she thinks she's great. And, you know, what's absent in this text that is present in Milton's Paradise Lost is the kind of the voice of the divine, and God speaks and leads Eve away. And, you know, that's Milton basically saying, you know, oh, look at Eve, isn't she so like obsessed with herself, and this is bad, and, you know, I have to take you to Adam, and here's what your purpose is. Mm-hmm. There's no voice in Frankenstein, there's no kind of divinity to say to the creature, no, this is the right path, come with me, or follow this path and I'll take you to your mate. So it's both a kind of, he's paralleled with Eve, and also in many other ways he's paralleled with Adam and also with Satan, but he's also not any of them, the creature. Mm-hmm. Which I think is just interesting.
And by watching the Lacey family here, he realizes he's also kind of shut out from their, from their experience of being together, that he's shut out from the rest of, the human race in a sense. And I had never yet seen a being resembling me or who claimed any intercourse with me. What was I? Now he's hoping that, he can meet with them and overturn all of this. This is his great hope, that he will be not my protectors, he called right at the very end of the chapter, my protectors, for so I loved in an innocent, half painful self-deceit to call them. I mean, that's his retrospectively commenting on how he thinks of them as his protectors, and they turn out not to be. Next week, everybody, you'll learn what happens then. Anastasia, you're going to stick around for this last chapter here on Satan?
Well, I think I'm going to head and I'm going to leave chapter 6 to in the capable hands of Mary and Lauren. But thank you so much for having me.
Are you going to go, or should I make you an attendee? And then
I will go back to being an attendee and see what you make of chapter 6. But thank you for having me.
I'm glad that our mishap with the time meant that we got to look at the chapter together at least.
yeah, that was very exciting.
Yeah.
Thanks for filling in. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem.
All righty. Bye-bye. The chapter 6. Now here's where we get the whole story. We get the history of the DeLacy family and also the history of Safie. And I love this point because this is the point in the novel, for everybody reading it, that we've talked about this in the very beginning, how this is a structured novel that kind of telescopes in and then comes back out. Walton's letters, and then we get Victor's story, and then we get the creature story. And then it kind of telegraphs back out, creature, Victor, Walton again. But there's a center to this, and that's the creature telling the story of the de Lacys, and then Safie. And actually, Safie's story is almost literally the center of this novel. Like if you page-wise it out, it's like you're at the Safie part of this book, is the very center. And I don't know how intentional that is on Mary Shelley's part in doing this. Clearly, she's intentional in the way the story goes in and then comes back out again. But but for me, it kind of keys Safie in as like almost the key, like she's the heart, like more than the creature. She winds up being the heart of the novel then, that this is what it's all about in one way, is this person but she has Safie gets the good, like the happy ending version of the story that she's telling, and not the creature. And it's nice that, and I'm happy that Mary Shelley puts it that way. A brief, let's just, let me just give a brief, like what the story is of the de Lacys and Safie and how they're all intertwined. In that the de Lacy family, they're from Paris and they're very affluent. And Safie's father is a Turkish merchant. And then he the government doesn't like the fact that he's Turkish. And so they throw him in prison and he's condemned to death. And they're really holding his religion and wealth against him. And then Felix is visiting him in prison. I mean, the father has a connection with him, and that's how they know him. And then Felix is visiting him in prison, and he meets Safie there, and the Turk, or he sees her at least, and the Turk, her father, promises her hand in marriage, and Felix and Safie then exchange letters. Felix was warned by several letters that he received from the lovely girl. I guess someone wrote them for her. I don't even think it says, because she doesn't understand French, obviously.
I think there's an old man that translates for her.
Servant of her father's who understood French. There you go. Thank you. And then there's that odd moment too where the creature says, I have copies of these letters, because he's telling the story to Victor right here at this moment. I have copies of these letters, for I found means during my residence in the hovel to procure the implements of writing, and the letters are often in the hands of Felix or Agatha. Before I depart, I will give them to you. They will prove the truth of my tale. The weird thing about evidence that Mary Shelley puts in the text there, which I find fascinating, and we never come back to it. But if you're creating a real Frankenstein set, the letters of Safie are like in there. It's her love letters to Felix.
It's really interesting, because this part is kind of described as the kind of feminist core of Frankenstein, the focus on Safie, and even the fact that there are letters, and especially in a kind of epistolary or kind of text-based or evidentiary-based novel, you can be like, oh, obviously they're just copies. How do we know they're true? But if you choose to disbelieve the creature, then surely you would also choose to disbelieve Victor, and then also why then would you believe Walton so it's part of this kind of like narrative conceit where you just have to accept that they are copies and that they are genuine. But I think it's really interesting that Shelley chooses, we don't get to read them as we do with all the other kind of layers of this text, and as we do with, say, Dracula, where we get all of the kind of the newspapers, the letters, and it is that kind of that unknowableness of what women are saying, and that kind of that secret hiddenness of women, and even that idea that it's separated again in her letters, in that she's not even writing them, she's speaking them, and someone else is translating and writing it down. It's again that kind of layer and that kind of that mystery, that separation between the kind of the female self and that kind of that feminist core that is unknowable. We don't,
and
we
because we assume that Victor thinks them unnecessary, because the creature, and this is when you get to that physicality of the text again, the creature gives Victor the letters, and Victor basically goes, I don't care. So it's that, again, that dismissiveness that we get with Elizabeth's narrative, with Justine, and her innocence versus his innocence, and things like, oh well, guilt. The creature is like, yes, the copies of Sophie's letters are important because they prove this, but also that's her voice. And he's like, yeah, her voice is just as important in this story as Felix's or mine or yours. Victor isn't interested. And he's not just interested because it's part of the creature's story. He's not interested because he doesn't see the purpose. And, you know, this is the part of the narrative where it gets really gothic in terms of the constructed narrative. Mary, what year is Melmoth published?
1820.
So it's
So
later.
a couple, like
2
years after.
This becomes a really popular trope in the later early Gothic, if that makes sense.
Melmoth, I have to kind of give like a little
audience. It's Melmoth the Wanderer by Charles McCurry.
By Charles
Melmoth the Wanderer. Who's
Oscar Wilde's uncle? Is it?
Yeah. So just a warning, as I did with Supernatural, for anyone that isn't aware of Charles. So Charles Maturin was an Irish Protestant clergyman. He wrote sermons by day and he wrote Gothic fiction by night, and they're both kind of wild. Let's just say that. Melmoth the Wanderer, published in 1820, is a ride, and it has so many different layers. You have and also so many different characters that are called the same name. So you have the Melmoth the Wanderer and his like great nephew John Melmoth, who is at the start in that kind of introductory frame, who then there's a Spanish escaped monk who washes up on the shore of Ireland and starts telling him his story. And then in that layer, he kind of ends up in the kind of underground tomb of a Jew in Spain, who's like transcribed this manuscript for me. So he's transcribing this manuscript, and then in this manuscript there's all these other, it's very confusing. And it's also I think it's 4 volumes. It's very long. So just a warning, if you are going to read this novel, it's a big bite if you want, and if you're not used to kind of Gothic text. But also, Oscar Wilde was his great nephew. And when Wilde was, I think it was before he was in prison, but he had a kind of calling card name made that he signed Melmoth, because he really, there's something about Melmoth the Wanderer that he really enjoyed. And just a kind of like trope that's in both Maturin's Melmoth the Wanderer and Oscar Wilde, the trope of the picture, the portrait. Wilde definitely gets it from Melmoth. I won't spoil it, although I guess if you know like a lot of
if you know the picture, then
alchemical stories, you might know the kind of the that trope. But but that just a kind of weird wild rabbit hole story.
That trope, I mean, Maturin does this too, but this becomes a really popular trope, particularly with narratives of the other. So you will often have, so like in Latham's The Midnight Bell, the heroine gets kidnapped, she meets a hermit, and then the hermit tells her his story. So like within the heroine's story is a hermit telling his story, and then he tells another family story. So you often get this kind of like narrative and a narrative and a narrative, but it's usually the other, be it the racial other or the sexual other. So in Latham's Midnight Bell, the hermit's narrative is a heavily queer coded narrative. So you often get this kind of nestled. And it's really interesting the way that Shelley constructs this text, that this is the narrative we have at the center, at the core, at the heart. It's also Walton's sister putting together Walton's letters, that Frankenstein is telling him the story that he says the creature told him, that the creature is telling that he's understood from letters and overhearing these people. So that kind of idea of the way that history develops and the way that history is shaped, and that this comes so quickly after the mention of ruins of empire. You know, when I know I always say, like, think about how Victor is putting together this story, think about how Walton then transcribes the story. You know, how much more might there be if the creature put this together? Like, how much more important, how much more structure, how much more, you know, would we get the letters? Like, it's a really interesting element of the feminism, of the otherness, of the orientalization in terms of Sappho and her father. But this is a really popular Gothic trope at this point in time, and it becomes more popular post Revolutionary Wars. So we kind of go to war and literature gets complicated. I mean, we have it earlier on with things like Tristram Shandy, but very much the Gothic fiction after 1794 kind of really engages and goes ham on this kind of metatextual matryoshka doll, Chinese puzzle narrative style. And the fact that Shelley engages with that with the creature, and if you compare the way the creature recounts the De Lacy narrative versus how Victor recounts Clerval or his parents' narrative, there, if you want to flick back and look at the way that Victor talks about his mum and how she met his dad versus the way that the creature talks about Felix and his father, and it's a really interesting parallel that I think we are supposed to kind of think about.
Let me give the end of this history here, and then I want to jump back into this key paragraph in the middle, which I'm going to ask you to read about Safie, about her mother, which I think winds up for me, like reading it this time, just like poured out, like just this was like the big beacon in this, section. But the father's in prison, and then Felix helps him escape, and then also gets passports for himself and his family, but then his family is captured for letting out, the Safie's father. And then Safie's father goes against the deal that he made and decides he loathed the idea that his daughter should be united to a Christian. Then the plot is discovered, and the De Lacys are thrown in jail, and they lose their entire fortune. They're put on trial, and then are exiled from the country, and then that's why they're in this little cottage here with no money. Safie at the same time is trying to attempted to expostulate with her father, but he left her angrily, reiterating his tyrannical mandate. And then Safie decides that she will, escape herself, and she's helped by a servant, and then she leaves, and then she's stranded because the attendant who brought her falls dangerously ill, but the people there, that she's staying with in Germany, bring her to show her the way to the De Lacys, and she's saved. But there's a couple things I want to mention, and it's this paragraph in the middle, and I want to show this Fugitives manuscript too, but let's talk for a few minutes about this paragraph about Safie's mother, and then we'll finish today with this Fugitives manuscript. That it is, do you have the Safie related that her mother was a Christian Arab? One of you want to read that paragraph?
Yeah. Do you want me to go?
Yeah,
Sure.
yeah, go for it.
Okay. Safie related that her mother was a Christian Arab, seized and made a slave by the Turks. Recommended by her beauty, she had won the heart of the father of Safie, who married her. The young girl spoke in high and enthusiastic terms of her mother, who, born in freedom, spurned the bondage to which she was now reduced. She instructed her daughter in the tenets of her religion and taught her to aspire to the higher powers of intellect and an independence of spirit forbidden to the female followers of Mahomet. This lady died, but her lessons were indelibly impressed on the mind of Safie, who sickened at the prospect of again returning to Asia, and being immured within the walls of a harem, allowed only to occupy herself with puerile amusements, ill-suited to the temper of her soul, now accustomed to grand ideas and a noble emulation for virtue. The prospect of marrying a Christian and remaining in a country where women were allowed to take a rank in society was enchanting to her.
Now, there are some obviously differences here, but for me, Mary Shelley's writing about her mother. She's writing about Mary Wollstonecraft here. I mean, and the mother dying and all this, but instructing her daughter in the tenets of religion, and taught her to aspire to higher powers of intellect, independence of spirit. I mean, it's this almost like wishful biography that Mary Shelley is writing, like, you know, because her mother died. And here it's like, if you just replace, you know, Islam in this, you know, passage with, you know, the restrictive, you know, society that they're born into in their Christian England, it is what Mary's mother, Mary Wollstonecraft, was writing about. But more than, but it's all, but again, I want to highlight this idea that not only is Safie's story and this whole thing at the center of the novel, like this is the center of Safie's story in a sense. Like this is winds up being the pinpoint heart of this whole novel, is this little bit about Safie and her mother. What do you think?
And again, this is the whole point of, you know, Saeed's point about Orientalism, is the fact that really it's not really about these kind of Oriental characters. That they are, I mean, I can come back to that and we can talk about how this also echoes Mary Wollstonecraft's like kind of anti-Islamic rhetoric that she has in A Vindication, but also like it's not really about that, like you say, it's about women or the woman, but imagined as the kind of you know, British Christian European woman. It's not really about the kind of the Islamic Arab woman in that way.
Yeah,
it's basically using Islam in the same way that the earlier Gothic uses Catholicism.
Yeah,
you know, it's not, and this is not an accurate portrayal of the Islamic world. It's not an accurate portrayal of Islam. It is using it in the same way that Catholicism is used 10 years before.
I was really happy my daughter noticed, my 16-year-old daughter Lulu noticed this. She was like, wow, the way she really criticizes, you know, Islam and you know, that seems so, you know, kind of wrong and othering, or I can't remember what the words that she used. And she noticed that right off the bat, that's happening in here. In this.
Yeah, and it's I always find this bit a little bit of an anomaly, because the thing about Orientalism at this point in time is that it switches between fear and affection. The Romantics are enamored in a lot of ways by the Oriental, and they're enamored by the idea of it, and you start to at this point get a lot of you know, Chinese philosophy, you get a lot of, you know, Turkish styles, you know, a lot of Turkish fashion is imported into Britain. Turkish food starts to become quite popular, so you do start to have this real romantic small r relationship with the region. And it's almost kind of, it could be anything, you know. It's just that in this situation, having him be Islamic works. Interestingly, he is Turkish.
Yeah.
And at this point in time, Greece and Turkey are having some very violent wars. Mm-hmm. Most of the sympathy is with Greece.
Yeah.
So I will say that I would read it more as, if we are to read this as critique, it is more of a scathing critique against Turkey that it is against Islam.
Well, I think it's
okay.
Go ahead. No, I was just going to say, I thought it was a critique of more the way women are treated within a particular, you know, structure, society, culture, religion.
Yeah, I find this point to be really kind of, I don't know, it doesn't quite hit for me, because in a lot of ways, female education under Islam was a lot more in line with the stuff that Vindications wants, than it is than perhaps, you know, Western Christianity was. Yeah. Of course, that doesn't work. It doesn't work for her to be like a young woman from Hampshire. Like, it doesn't work in the same way. But the otherness here is it's performative. I agree with that.
It's what she's accusing them of is more true for her than the society she's accusing it for. Yes. Mary?
Yeah, so I think what you have here, the kind of conflation of cultural identities, and also the kind of construction of ethnic religious identities, and I think especially in kind of Europe and Britain, in that kind of imaginary of people's imaginations where they would construct others, it often would be erroneous, and it would be false. And one of the big kind of ideas in this period about Islam was the idea that women weren't seen as rational, or weren't seen as to have, to even have souls in some way. But what you have with Safi, and especially her father, you have these kinds of constructs of the kind of despotic other, the Turk, who is vengeful and bad, and he fits into that kind of ethnic religious stereotype of both a kind of evil Muslim father and also an evil Turkish father. And his function, really, the way that he works in this part is to allow Felix to show his benevolence. Look how benevolent Felix is. He rescues a Turkish man from prison. He saves him from death, and then look how the Turk repays him. It's really using him and his kind of villainy to show up the goodness of Felix. And Safi is the kind of the good sexualized exotic other. She's also, I mean, I talked earlier about, bloodlines. She has, it's okay, she's good, she's safe, she has a Christian mother, but also she is a Christian Arab. And you do have, especially in this period, I mean, even now, to be honest, the focus on, the purity of bloodlines, especially when it comes to nobility. So you had earlier that kind of talk about, what was that line? Noble blood, rank, descent, and noble blood, the idea that nobility were born and it's something inherited. And if you think about the idea of the monarchy, it is, monarchs are, and the idea and the concept of monarchy, they're inherently racist, because they're formed around this idea that one specific bloodline is better than all of the other. And the importance of that purity of bloodline, and the problem of racial or religious or ethnic religious contamination of that bloodline. So here you have the idea of the prospect of marrying a Christian, and marriage being a kind of another way, like conversion, that you could kind of work to convert the kind of the other, specifically women, because obviously men are more threatening, I guess, in that kind of, from that bloodline perspective. But even still, even when she's married, she will still be the Arabian, and that idea of that kind of contamination of bloodlines, which you don't really get worked through more, really. It's just kind of hinted at a little bit here, but it is there. And I think it's odd why Shelley puts it in. And I don't know if she really understands what she's doing, but I think a lot of texts, especially texts that feature whether it's Jewish characters or whether it's Muslim characters in this period, there is always that kind of unspoken tension about bloodlines and about racial or religious purity.
I find this section to be quite anomalous in that way, like, because we have Safi, so there's this whole idea that woman is the embodiment of national virtue, and therefore woman is embodiment of virtue. So in being educated by her mother, it's not so much necessarily about the bloodline, but she inherits her mother's education, she inherits her mother's love for freedom. Therefore, Safi comes to embody the same values that her mother embodies, and that kind of protects her. By adding this level of the story, and it does kind of like complicate and problematize it. And I almost feel like, compared to the rest of the novel, this is a very stereotypical Gothic frame, and it works for the plot. And in a lot of Gothic fiction, it's not thought about much more than that, or it is intentionally racist, intentionally xenophobic. It is to display it as a threat. And I do almost feel like, to make it work, Shelley almost complicates her own message about, female education and the way that women are educated, because a lot of Vindications is about the fact that women are stunted by education and that the system of education makes women stupid. And she actually likens it to military education. Soldiers are trained to dance and sing and perform, and therefore they have no individuality, they have no sense of judgment, they're poorly educated. So that's what she's kind of related. This moment about Safie and her mother is mirroring and paralleling what Vindications is saying about female education. The addition of this orientalization kind of almost skews it, because and I wonder, you get this a lot in this period's fiction, where the racism and the xenophobia is so baked into culture that it's perhaps something that a writer who is sympathetic to the Native American plight, or sympathetic to, you know, the state of Europe and is pushing against xenophobia, probably perhaps didn't see the problem with this in the way that we would see the problem with it.
Yeah.
And that is a conflict that we have all the time, because I mean, Jane Austen uses the M word at one point to mean a small, not very good sum of money. And it's just one of those things that we have to take into account when we're talking about these novels, but we also have to think about, to what extent do they intend? It doesn't make it not racist, but to what extent is this a critique of race or of culture?
I think as progressive as Mary Shelley is in her politics and her ideas, she's still bound by this idea of Western culture.
Yeah, I mean,
far more advanced than this
Wollstonecraft,
Asiatic Eastern culture.
Yeah, Wollstonecraft is extremely homophobic.
Yeah.
Vindications of Rights of Women lambasts equivocal beings, men who are too effeminate. And it really hammers home an actually really problematic gender binary, and is very tied up in queer anxiety. And I think that the way that the same issues that we have in Vindications with the gender binary and sexuality, we have here with race and bloodlines, and it does complicate it. And this is why I think back when me and Mary said, you know, we have to be careful when we call Shelley a feminist, because it's not intersectional. Was Shelley somebody that we could have explained this to? Probably.
I was just thinking of that conversation about feminism and how it's problematic, and especially in terms of Mary Wollstonecraft, actually, because I mean, like you say, like Vindication is incredibly homophobic, but also just go and do a quick search about all the times that Wollstonecraft talks about you know, harems or Muhammad or you know, Mohammedan in Vindication, that there are significant amounts of times, and she does kind of I think similar to what Shelley is doing here, in that it's creating this kind of construct of Islam to use as a foil against Western Christianized Britain, where Islam, Turkey, the Ottoman Empire, they are constructed as barbaric, uncivilized, irrational. But look what we could have here. Like, you could have rational Christianity, and that's the kind of pinnacle. You know, you want to, if you are othered in this kind of racialized or religious way, you want to marry a Christian man. And at the same time, again, like for Felix, it works in a similar way to the way that her father does, in that he gets to marry a kind of Christian Arab and show, look how benevolent I am and tolerant I am. And I hate that word tolerant, but I think that's exactly what it's doing in the way that these characters are working.
Yeah, what you get a lot of this period is the difference between awareness and understanding and symbology. A woman like Shelley or a woman like Wollstonecraft should have been well aware, or would have been well aware of to a certain extent, what the reality of the Islamic Empire was. And, you know, most of the kind of more educated philosophical romantics were kind of aware of this stuff, but it works. The kind of foil, the mirror works. And it doesn't, to them at that point, complicate. So you have that kind of, that weird, oh, well, we're sympathetic to Native Americans and it's terrible because that was colonial and that was empire, but we can still see, even though, you know, the Crusades were violent and bloody Christian, we're going to condemn them, but we're also going to condemn these people because they're also an empire. and they do X, Y, and Z, and that makes them problematic too. So that means we can use them as a negative. So it's that kind of, there's no complexity here. It doesn't matter. It does matter, but it kind of doesn't matter. So it's a really interesting kind of, how much do we take from this? My take is that she replaces the convent and the tyrannical Catholic father with Islam, the harem, and the tyrannical Turkish Islamic father. And she uses the Christian enslaved mother to embody Wollstonecraft, and Vindications itself as a text is really becoming mother here, which is another interesting thing, that the text is more mother to Shelley than the woman is, because that's what she has left.
Yeah.
But yeah, the framing here is it's almost too tropey. It is just, this is such a Gothic trope, such a stereotypical Gothic trope.
Let me finish today too with this manuscript share of something in our collections, because I think this is where her appeal for this whole situation comes from, and that Mary Shelley's own experience with running away with Percy, and how her father, he's not quite tyrannical, but he certainly doesn't support her and shuts her out for the time until they're married. But we have in our collection at the Rosenbach this manuscript of a poem by Percy that Mary saved and then published in the posthumous poems of Shelley, I think. And this is the first page of it, and it doesn't have a title, but Mary gives it a title when she publishes it, and she calls it The Fugitives. And the poem itself is about a young couple eloping and fleeing from a father and going off on her own. I mean, and it begins, the waters are flashing. It's always hard for me to read it. I have to pull up my own copy of it. The waters are flashing, the white hail is dashing, the lightnings are glancing, the horse spray is dancing away. The whirlwind is rolling, the thunder is tolling, the forest is swinging, the minster bells ringing, come away. The earth is like ocean, wreck strewn and in motion, bird, beast, man, and worm have crept out of the storm, come away. This is them fleeing over, the ocean, and they get in this boat to go away. And down here at the bottom is, actually, it's the next page, and here's the rest of the poem. And I love this part of it too, because it's this young couple fleeing, and it is right here is, but she cried, ply the oar, put off gaily from the shore. And I love that it's the young woman in the couple that's like, come on, let's get out of here. Like almost as if she's taking the oar. I mean, obviously they have someone rowing them, because they're not going to row. And they flee. And towards the end of the poem, it is actually, it's here. It's in the, and fearest thou, and seest thou, and hearest thou, and drive we not free o'er the terrible sea, I and thou. One boat cloak doth cover the loved and the lover. Their blood beats one measure. They murmur proud pleasure, soft and low. That it's a story about this young couple fleeing together. And towards the end, it's on the topmost watch turret, as the death boding spirit. Where is that? And the topmost, as the death boding spirit stands the gray tyrant father, watching them and then cursing them as they're going away. And not that Mary's own experience was quite this dramatic, and her father being this tyrannical person standing at the top of the turret, but certainly she felt this, I think, when they run away together and her father does not support them and this relationship that they have. I mean, they think, and Percy especially thinks, that, hey, you wrote about marriage being, like institutions like marriage being no good and we shouldn't follow them. Well, in Godwin's it's to his credit, was like, yeah, I wrote that when I was young. I actually changed that in later editions. And I actually married the woman to help support my children. So he didn't actually support this kind of thing anymore. But also the glaring problem with this is that Percy was already married and had children, and he was abandoning his wife and children, and Godwin had an issue with that, rightfully so. But the fact that Mary calls this the fugitives, and I certainly think that she felt that at that point in her life, that they were fugitives running away from their family and the world and striking out on their own. And in this novel itself, we have this, story of, Safie becoming this fugitive from her father and running away to be with the person that she loves. I think that there is a very personal appeal to this story, which is at the heart of this novel. Is this, and as tropey as it is, it's got to really appeal to Mary Shelley to have this part of it,
Yeah. And like with the creature, because we talk a lot about the fact that the creature is and I hesitate to use the word effeminized because of what we mean when we say effeminized in literary criticism at this time. But the creature is abandoned by his father. Safie runs from her father. Shelley runs from her father. What you have is the vulnerability that then leads to, because to be without father is to be without legal protection, to be without financial protection, to be without physical protection. So you have that kind of narrative of having to make one's own way in the world by choice or not. And that parallels a lot of Gothic heroine stories, because it's that kind of thing of, a father abandoning a daughter or a daughter running from a father is a very big decision, because you are either putting yourself at the mercy of the person you're running with, or you're putting yourself at the mercy of the world. And it hammers home with the creature, because Safie's made the choice because she knows that that's the right thing to do for herself and morally / ethically. And it really hammers home Victor's mistreatment of the creature, because the creature, as he says just before this, has no home, no property, no name, no finance. And without that, he's essentially nothing. And that's that kind of, the fugitive state for a woman is extremely dangerous, because you are abandoning the one thing that protects you, essentially. And we could argue about what protection that actually is, but it kind of highlights in the father's tyranny, and in it's so tyrannical that Safie that she is willing to do this.
Yeah.
It then also highlights how terrible Victor leaving the creature is.
Yeah. And this chapter ends with, that Safie is kind of abandoned and left, alone and ignorant of the world around her, just like the creature. But she falls into good hands, the text says. And then she's enabled to reunite with, her lover at the end, and arrive in the safety at the cottage of her lover, which is the last line of the chapter. So you guys are getting the end early today, because like, oh, I'm free now. It's a little after, or after whatever time it is there. A little after 8. Is that what it is there?
Yeah, it's just after 8.
So, and usually you're after 9 when we're finishing here. So, any final comments on this before I wrap it up here? I thought you gave them right there.
Yeah, I think we said. I think it's difficult to do these, particularly this chapter.
Well, I specifically scheduled you guys for this chapter. So I'm glad
it's kind of difficult to talk about this chapter. This is usually a chapter that we would talk about from a specific focus, because there's so much to dig into about it. And you could have 3 academic papers all talk about just this chapter, and they'd all talk about something different, because you've got so many things going on here. There's so much to talk about in this one quite short chapter. And I do think it often not gets neglected, but like when we're thinking about the story on a broader sense, you know, the creature and Victor don't figure in this chapter, so we usually use this chapter to then think about the creature and Victor, or we use it to think about Mary, because they're the you know, the approaches that we take. But I do think there's a lot to be said here about the kind of burgeoning narrative of feminism at this point in time, and how in that paragraph about Safi and her mother, that we basically get vindications of the rights of women being a mother. The actual text is presented as mother to a young woman, and I think that is a kind of really interesting conceit, that we talk about Wollstonecraft as the mother of feminism, but in so many ways it's the text itself, like the actual physical text, a very problematic text. But for Shelley, she has the text and she doesn't have the woman, so that kind of parallel is just really interesting. But yeah, I hope everyone enjoyed this chapter. There's just so much to say about it.
Mary, you have anything to add before I sign us off?
I mean, we can go on so many other tangents.
We could go another hour, right?
Yeah,
yeah,
easily.
Let's just go to a 9, right? No, I mean, I think just to sum up, like for me, what's always been interesting about this, especially in parallel with Paradise Lost, are the kind of the overlaps, especially with the creature, also with Victor, with more so with the creature in terms of Adam, Eve, and Satan. And I always forget their names. I think it's Susan Gilbert and Sandra Gruber.
Yeah.
Gilbert and Gruber. They have a really great book about women writers in the 19th century, which has a chapter on the creature as Eve.
Mad Woman in the Attic.
Yeah, that's exactly it. Yeah, I'm doing so badly with names and titles today. But yeah, it's about Shelley's monstrous Eve, and I really like their kind of argument and the reading of the creature in that as that kind of Eve figure. I don't think I necessarily would agree with it, but I think there's a lot that you can do in terms of reading the creature from a gender perspective, and especially, you know, as Lauren said, this chapter, especially these chapters, the heart of the book, it's about women, mothers, and the way that the creature is doubled with Safi, and then also with Eve, you do get a feminization of the creature. And I think it does, as this novel does with us in so many reasons, it does make us question, you know, those questions of gender. There is only one creature, there's only one creation, and we just automatically assume masculine, I guess, because he's sexed that way. But we can unpack that a bit more and maybe think beyond that kind of gender binary in terms of the creature, which I think these 2 chapters do kind of allow us to start questioning that. So yeah, I guess that's what I would add.
Good. No, that's great. Well said. So thank you. All righty. Franken readers, thank you all for tuning in today. We'll post this recording on our website, and if that's how you're watching it, or on YouTube, thanks for watching. We have a Sundays with Frankenstein Facebook group where we continue the conversation. You can look us up on Facebook and join in that conversation. I'm always available to answer questions via email. Next week's co-host will be, again, Dr. Anastasia Klimchinskaya, who is on today as well. She'll be back next week. The first edition of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein and that manuscript of Percy Shelley's poem are just 2 of the many gems of the Rosenbach's collections. If you're looking for more virtual engagement, you can head on over to the Rosenbach website, check out the other virtual offerings we have, including the talk this Thursday night by Dave Gustin. We also have our gallery gateways and exhibitions online, and the Rosenbach is also open. You can sign up and for a time ticket for your visit, 1 party at a time. You get to enjoy the exhibits in the museum all by your lonesome if you choose. You can check out our new exhibition on 19th century Japanese sailor Manjiro. And I also ask you to please support the Rosenbach, which you can do by donation. And if you're not already a member, I invite you to join, especially the basic membership level, the Mary Shelley level. Lauren and Mary, thank you for being here today.
Thank you,
Thank
and
you for
apologies
having us.
again that we were late.
Glad you could jump on. As we were hitting the top of the hour, I thought, they don't know the time change. Like, I knew it right off the bat. I was like, I don't believe I didn't say this. So I sent you an email real quick as the credits were playing, like, we're on now. So you'll find that email later.
There was some
thank you to Anastasia as well.
Yes,
for,
thank you so
for
much.
Thanks for filling in for us, but also thanks for it was nice to be on to actually be
and thank
chat
you
as well.
Thank you to George for Facebook messaging me. There was some furious, terrible typoed messages from me to Mary saying, "Oh my god, get on the computer."
Yeah. And thanks, Anastasia, for being on today. And I'll see you next week, Anastasia. Join us next week on Sundays with Frankenstein for chapters 7 and 8 of volume 2, when the creature reads books. I love that. We get creature book reports. And the creature will finally introduce himself to the DeLacy's. That'll go really well, right? Okay. Once again, will be played out by Tucker Christine's pleated gazelle song, It's Alive. Farewell, wandering spirits, and remember, you have hope and the world before you. Thanks for coming, everybody. Bye-bye.
I have some cat